The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to the 70 disciples, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But at the judgment, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades. Whoever listens to you, listens to me. And whoever rejects you, rejects me. And whoever rejects me, rejects the one who sent me." The Gospel inspired by God. Maybe the last thing in the world that we should regard as gospel truth is the Gospels. It's a bit like telephone tag. Did you play that when you were kids? We used to call it, for some reason or other, in Ireland it was called Chinese whispers, where you get a group of kids together and I whisper into Maureen's ear something and she whispers into Helen and Helen does to Margie and it goes around the whole group and then finally Jen announces what she heard at the end and it's going to be totally different from what I said to, yeah. So it's a little bit like that, the Gospels as we read them today very often. So the first thing is that we have to realize again and again and again that Jesus loves to startle his audiences. This is a very, very difficult statement. Woe to you, Bethsaida. Woe to you, Chorazin. What about you, Capernaum? You're going to go down to hell, Hades. And so he loves to startle his audience, to try to wake them up to think for themselves. So that's the first piece in the puzzle. So he'll exaggerate wildly and he'll startle his audience. The second piece to realize is that at the time that this gospel has been written, something has really happened to the young Jesus movement. They've been thrown out of the synagogues, mainly because between 66 AD and 70 AD, when Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans, the Jesus movement refused to get involved in the freedom struggle. They were pacifists, they refused to get involved, so they were despised by normative Judaism for not taking part in the struggle. So they were kicked out of the synagogues, which meant that they were now officially designated by Rome as a superstition. A superstition is a technical term in religious thinking. A superstition is not, if you meet a black cat, you should go back home, or don't walk under a ladder. That's not a superstition. The superstition was believing in a new religion that had no antiquity behind it. And so the Romans were very careful when they conquered a territory that they paid fealty to the local gods. They continued to worship whatever gods were in charge of that piece of real estate, as well as their own gods back home. So they insisted that the local population continue to observe and to worship their own gods. So the Romans didn't want to incur the wrath of the gods when they conquered the place. So they insisted that the Jews continued to worship their God. And here's now this group of people who refused to worship the local God. So this is a threat to Rome, because the local gods could get really upset with this Christian group and the Romans would get caught in the crossfire. So that's the second piece. So now this new Jesus movement has been persecuted. So now they're feeling really, really bad because you guys did it to us. They're not blaming the Romans, they're blaming their fellow Jews. You kicked us out and here's now what's happening. So that's the second piece of the puzzle. The third piece of the puzzle is that it's a kind of what I term a retroactive prognostication. It is very, very easy to prophesy very, very accurately when you're doing it after the event that you prophesied has actually happened. And so the towns have been destroyed. When Luke is writing this in 80 AD, not only is Jerusalem destroyed, but these cities, Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum, they've been destroyed as well. And these were the cities where Jesus mainly preached. He only went down to Jerusalem on a few occasions. Mainly he was in Galilee, and these are the cities in Galilee, the places he preached, and they've been destroyed. And so now it's very easy to go back and say, see, I told you, here's what Jesus says, he prophesied that you guys will do this. So that's the third stage. And the fourth stage is these gospel accounts are redacted and edited over the first 300 years of the life of the church. And you're going to get different versions of them depending on which community they're coming out of. So you listen to a passage like this today, and you've got to take it with large pinches of salt. Did he really say that? Is that what he meant? So what did Jesus mean? Is Jesus saying, for instance, that he's wishing evil and fire and brimstone on the cities in which he actually preached, that the cities in which he actually walked, that he's calling down fire from heaven on them? Isn't that what it's about? Or is it that somehow that Jesus is kind of rejecting the religion of his birth and wanting bad things to happen? Or is he in fact okaying the vilification and the persecution of Jews for the next 15 or 16 or even 2,000 years? Is that what's happening? Is this what he's saying here? It has nothing got to do with that. What it has to do is, it's an invitation to every single one of us to measure our performance against the values of the Gospels, the real gospel, the good news as preached by Jesus Christ at the time. To measure my own performance, against, what I say I believe in. And for us as cultures, and particularly as allegedly Christian countries, to measure our performance as a country and as a culture against the Christian message that we purport to believe in. And we have a terrible track record. You look at Christianity, as soon as it became into a position of power in the 4th century, it began to persecute other religions at that time. We sent crusades across Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. We created inquisitions. We came with the conquistadors. And here is a Christian nation, the United States of America, continuing to expand its empire in the world today, just as the Christian nation of England did in its empirical days, and the Christian nation of Spain did in its empirical days, and the Christian nation of Portugal did in its days. And this is a condemnation not just of the gap between our performance and our belief systems as Christians. It's true of most of the world's religions. It's true of Islam in our times as well. This extraordinary group called ISIS, who are prepared to behead people and crucify people in the name of Allah. So it's this invitation. Christ's message today is primarily for us as individuals to measure our performances against what we say we believe, particularly around compassion and forgiveness, and to measure the performance of the cultures of which we are a part and the religions to which we belong, our performance as a religion against the belief systems we allegedly have in Jesus. Yeah. So what I'm saying is this, that we use the phrase the gospel truth as if you could take every single line and every word in this document and believe it's literally accurate, and it's not. For the reasons I told you. For one thing, Jesus loves to startle. So for instance, when Jesus says stuff like, it is harder for a rich man to get to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That was absolutely shocking to his time, because being rich, being healthy, wealthy, Jewish, and male, were the signs of God's benediction. And that was Jesus saying, if you're rich, you're accursed. You can't even get to heaven. Imagine the effect of that on his audience. Or when he says stuff like, if your right eye scandalize you, pluck it out and throw it away from you. Better to enter heaven with one eye than to, be in Gehenna with two eyes. Or if your right leg scandalize you, cut it off. Better to enter into heaven with one leg than to go with two legs, into hell. So this is a real shocking kind of stuff. What the hell is he on about? So he's a real shock jock. And the reason is he's trying to wake up people to think for themselves. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece is you now get a church community that doesn't understand what he was doing. And so they're taking his words literally, as fundamentalist Christians will take his word literally today. And, use it to justify slavery, or to the persecution of gay people. So you get all these, corruptions of his word. Then you get the fact that the Gospels have been redacted and edited many, many times in early Christian history. You put all these three pieces together, and then you have to look at this document and say, what is the real meaning in here? Is it the obvious, literal meaning, or do we have to start digging much, much deeper? So that's what I mean by saying you have to take it with a grain of salt. Great image, great.
Why does it have to be so hard?
I think for a few reasons. One is that we make it a lot harder than it needs to be. Yeah? And the second thing is that there is, we come to this little planet to test ourselves, to test our resolve. In the interstitial, in the kind of the incarnational periods in which we're back at source, it's a piece of cake to be loving, because there's no confrontation of any kind, there's no evil of any kind. And so we come down here and we accept 4 limitations in order to stretch our soul's ability to grow. Because it's the experience of limitation that allows us to develop our qualities. So I keep using this image of, you take your typical athlete, an Olympic athlete, who for 4 years, nobody will ever hear of them. But every single morning, they're working out in the gym. They're going to be running along beaches. They're going to be lifting weights. They're going to be punishing their bodies again and again and again and again, so that when they get on the track on the day of the Olympics themselves, they'll be able to take off like a hare. So limitation is the key to developing the qualities inherent in us. We've volunteered for this. It's hard because we specifically chose a world which is almost 50% dark and 50% light. There are other places we incarnate which is much, much easier. And in between lifetimes, it's a piece of cake. We're consolidating what we've learned. But we come here, we volunteer specifically to be on a planet in which it's very, very difficult. But then we make it more difficult for ourselves by the ways in which we fail to follow and to align with the very values we espouse. We say we're followers of Jesus Christ, who said, love your enemies. How much love of your enemies is happening, in international politics, ever? The only two countries I'm aware of that followed this policy of loving your enemies were two non-Christian countries. The Dalai Lama in Tibet, and Mahatma Gandhi in India. I don't know of any Christian country who's ever, when they were in a position of power, whoever followed this injunction to love your enemies, and certainly not the United States of America in 2016. Absolutely not. Absolutely. Obama has started more wars than anybody before him. We've been involved in one conflict after the other, because he's a puppet, and whoever gets elected next time is going to be a puppet. The people who are pulling the strings are not the presidents, or they're doing what they're told. Question is, who's pulling the strings? That's a question for another day. Absolutely. And in 30 years' time, there'll be some dude standing here and saying, this idea that had to do with the id and the soul is poppycock. It didn't mean that at all. It means whatever it'll mean at that stage. Because we're on an evolutionary trajectory. We're trying to move more and more into the real meaning of what Jesus is teaching us. And every generation will do it a little bit differently. So there are generations, for instance, which pointed to the scriptures as justification for the Crusades. There's stuff in the scriptures that justified the Inquisition, where literally you tore Christians, some Christians tearing other Christians apart limb by limb because of orthodoxy. And so again and again and again, we have to measure our performance against the real core values. And the core value is love. And if it's not constant with and aligned totally with love, we still haven't measured up to what Jesus' message was. So every generation is going to try to push it forward a little bit. And in the trajectory things, graphs don't go in straight lines. Even human evolution doesn't go in a straight line like this. I believe it's going forward. If you look at the starting point and the end point, there's an upward trajectory, but it goes like this. So there are peaks and valleys. So if you take any one period of human history, you take, for instance, the Crusades, we were on a downslope. You take the Inquisition, we're on a downslope. You take the conquistadores, you're on a downslope. You take 9/11 and our response to it as a Christian nation, you're on a downslope. But by and large, if you look at the time of Jesus and the amount of warfare in the world, and even in our times, it's an upward trajectory. If you look at human rights, it's an upward trajectory. I understand what you're saying, Margaret, and I'm doing that on purpose. I'm trying to make you think, and you're obviously thinking. That's the object of the exercise.
Yeah, well.
Of course, it has something to do with that. It's got something to do with everything. Every interpretation that was made of this, it has something to do with it, because that's what it meant to the people. I'm trying to wake us up and saying it has nothing got to do with it, because that's not the best interpretation of the data in our times, in our civilization, at our stage of evolution as a human family. The other ones were appropriate and okay for people at different stages of evolution. It is not appropriate for us to be thinking those terms. It is not appropriate to think that Jesus was rejecting his own people. It is not appropriate to think that Jesus was saying his blood be upon us and upon our children. It is not okay to be thinking that. It is not okay to persecute gays. It's not okay to have slaves, depending on our interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures. It's not okay at all. So it has nothing got to do with that for our generation. If we're serious about our growth, we've far bypassed that kind of stuff. It had something to do with us when we were there then, and it has something to do with the people who are still there. But if we're serious about our spirituality, it has nothing got to do with us today. So it's a history. We can't reject our history. We have to understand where we've come from. And Jesus specifically refused to speak in historical terms, in mathematical terms, in philosophical terms, or in theological terms. He insisted on using parable stories, because a story is always fresh. Every generation of seekers will go back to the same story and see a whole new depth in it that previous generations with the same story didn't see. So we repeat it because the stories are the key piece to it. They're always fresh. They're always alive. Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
But it's not for us.
It doesn't have to
We're
do
not
with-
we're not in the Middle Ages. We're not advocating crusades. We're not in the conquistadors. So it has nothing got to do with our spirituality today. If our spirituality today, is commensurate with those interpretations, we'll still be killing Jews. We'll still be killing blacks. We'll still be killing gays. So it has nothing got to do with our spirituality as members of COJ in 2016. We've gone way beyond that. The best way to listen to get it is for every single one of us to stretch a little bit, to get out of our comfort zone, but to move towards more and more unconditional love. I can get out of my comfort zone by going backwards or by going forwards. I could go back to being, a total believer in violence as a response to solving human problems. That would be getting out of my present comfort zone, where I'm against violence, but I'd be going backwards. So I would say the best way to work with it is to stretch myself outside my comfort zone, but to make sure I'm moving towards more and more compassion for more and more people, or more and more beings, and more unconditional love. So there have to be some kinds of orienting principles, because there are always competing abilities and competing theories out there. So how do you figure out which one is right and which one is wrong? So there have to be some kinds of orienting principles that say these are good ones and those are not good ones. So what are the orienting principles? The primary one is love. Is it really moving us towards love? Is it ending prejudice? Is it leading towards compassion? Is it actually creating peace in our times? If it's not doing those four things, it's not a good system, no matter how appealing it may appear to be. So there have to be some guidelines that you can use when you're faced with any new theory from any new source. You have to be able to measure it against 3 or 4 of these parameters and say, does it fulfill these things? Is it making me a more loving person, a more compassionate individual? Is it getting rid of prejudice I had, or is it creating a new prejudice for me? Is it making me angry, or is it making me soft? So these are the ones I have to measure every new theory by. Because God is love. That's ultimately, if you'd put one word on what God is love. It's not that God loves or God has love, but God is love. They're synonyms. And so when you move towards love, you're moving towards God. And if you're moving away from love and you're justifying any kind of violence, you're moving away from God. And that is a bad system. Or at least it's not as good a system as one that's moving you toward love. Absolutely. Totally. Absolutely. You have to look at the story that you've just made up in your heart and the words you just created in your own mind, and ask, is that creating peace in the world? Is that creating, my response, is it putting loving energy out into the universe after that person, or is it just stirring the stuff up? And so I have to retract very, very quickly. Okay, I thought this really negative thought, and I said this really negative word. I'm really sorry. I do this regularly myself, because people, I'm Irish, I've got a short fuse as well. But I try to catch myself immediately, and I do this Buddhist prayer for whoever the person is. May you be free from all harm. May you be truly happy. May you be healthy and strong. May you be in alignment with God. And I try to send that energy after the bad thoughts I had in my mind about the individual, 3 seconds beforehand. I mean, even the gesture of just opening your hands, or, opening your chest, letting love in and love out, even that physical gesture itself already is, it's like it's a sacramental, it's a physical sign of what the heart is attempting to do.